quiet countdown is happening across the globe. Missiles aren't flying yet, but alliances are shifting, weapons are being positioned, and every move is signaling a storm ahead. When World War III begins, it won't be announced, it'll be deduced. As of this week, the United States finds itself in the most precarious geopolitical position since the Cold War, not because a single event has triggered global panic, but because multiple silent shifts are converging into something far more dangerous. Officially, there's no declaration of war, no mobilization orders broadcast to the public. But behind that calm surface, the architecture of global balance is eroding. Trade routes are being rerouted, defense budgets are exploding, alliances are hardening into blocks, and nations that once played defense are now openly preparing for offense. The American empire, while still dominant in raw power, is visibly stretched across too many fronts. Its influence is no longer automatic, and its credibility, both to allies and adversaries, is under strain. But that doesn't make it weaker in the short term. It makes it more unpredictable, because history doesn't suggest that declining empires go quietly. In fact, the opposite is true. When dominance begins to slip, empires often act with sudden, overwhelming force, not to expand, but to prevent collapse. What we're witnessing is not miscalculation, it's alignment, movement, positioning. This is not the buildup to an accidental war. It's the shaping of the battlefield before the first shot is fired. Let's start with the Middle East, where the most volatile fault line is no longer theoretical. It's active, exposed, and dangerously close to ignition. On June 13th, Israel executed a surgical strike so precise and so targeted that it effectively attempted to remove the brain of Iran's military and nuclear apparatus in a single blow. This wasn't a symbolic warning, it was a decapitation attempt in strategic terms, aimed at dismantling leadership before future escalation. Iran's response came quickly, but it was measured, calibrated not to provoke a broader war, which many in the West called strategic restraint. But the restraint wasn't just strategic, it was survival-driven. Because Iran isn't just facing Israel, it's facing the entire umbrella of American support, surveillance, and enforcement. Tehran understands that an overreaction could invite a response not just from Israeli jets, but from American bombers, satellites, and intelligence infrastructure. Yet while the regime calculates, pressure inside Iran is building. Military commanders, political hardliners, and even segments of the population see the limited response as weak, even humiliating. The mood on the streets is shifting from patriotism to frustration. And when internal legitimacy starts to crack, regimes historically turn outward. That's the risk no analyst can predict precisely. The moment when domestic pressure pushes Tehran into a bolder move. That move, even if it's limited, could cross a red line that leads to an Israeli counterstrike. And that's where the threat jumps levels, because Israel doesn't operate under conventional rules of engagement. Its military doctrine includes the so-called Samson option, a policy of massive, disproportionate retaliation if it perceives an existential threat. This is not a myth, it's not classified speculation. It's part of Israel's national defense posture, and it includes the use of nuclear weapons if necessary. So while the region looks relatively quiet right now, that calm is deceptive. The fuse has already been lit. What no one can tell you is how long it is, or how far the fire has already traveled. In Europe, the war in Ukraine has shifted into a phase that's more dangerous precisely because it's becoming background noise. The headlines have quieted, but the battlefield has not. Beneath the surface, the intensity is accelerating. Ukraine now claims it's manufacturing over 200,000 combat drones every single month. That number sounds extreme until you realize they're small, inexpensive, and designed for swarm tactics. These aren't consumer-grade quadcopters. They're battlefield assets, programmed to hit Russian supply convoys, disrupt artillery positions, and serve as the eyes and fists of a digitally coordinated front line. It's warfare at scale, made cheap and relentless. On the Russian side, the approach remains brutally conventional: artillery saturation, trench warfare, relentless pressure across the Donbas. But Moscow is adapting too. Their electronic warfare capabilities have expanded, their missile barrages are probing deeper, and their industrial base, despite sanctions, is proving harder to cripple than many Western strategists expected. In response, NATO is no longer pretending to be a neutral observer. The alliance is moving from symbolic support to operational posturing, German boots are now on the ground in the Baltics for the first time since 1945. That's not just history repeating, that's history reversing. U.S. and allied F-35 fighter jets are flying regular patrols just minutes from Russian airspace, creating a buffer zone that looks a lot like preparation for active engagement. And just weeks ago, NATO executed a massive logistics exercise simulating the rapid deployment of 40,000 troops across Eastern Europe in under 72 hours. That kind of drill isn't about defense. It's about readiness for high-speed war. It tells you what the generals are expecting, even if politicians won't say it out loud. Behind closed doors, the calculus is shifting. Military analysts, war game simulations, and strategic planning teams increasingly converge on a grim forecast. A direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is not just possible, it's likely within the next 18 months. And if Donald Trump returns to the White House, many believe the timeline won't stretch, it'll snap. Because his doctrine isn't about diplomacy through delay. It's about force through pressure. And pressure has a breaking point. Meanwhile, the Indo-Pacific theater is bracing for its own ignition point, one that may come not with bombs, but with silence. Taiwan, once seen as a diplomatic gray zone, is now being transformed into a fortified spearhead. This isn't just defensive aid, it's strategic militarization. The United States has embedded advanced weapons systems throughout the island, long-range anti-ship missiles capable of denying sea access, swarms of autonomous drones designed for saturation attacks, and hardened, multi-layered coastal batteries all aimed directly at the mainland. Taiwan is being engineered to function as a forward operating base, one that slows, bleeds, or even entraps a Chinese amphibious landing. This strategy is often referred to as the porcupine doctrine, and it's working. But the assumption that China will engage on those terms may be dangerously wrong. Beijing isn't interested in storming beaches it can disable with keystrokes. Chinese military thought, shaped by centuries of asymmetric warfare, doesn't prioritize head-to-head confrontation. It prioritizes systems disruption, psychological paralysis, information dominance. The goal isn't to fight harder, it's to make the enemy incapable of reacting at all. Western intelligence has quietly raised alarm bells over what they suspect to be pre-positioned cyber assets, so-called sleeper cells, not in the traditional sense, but embedded within global infrastructure. Data centers, port logistics, telecom routing systems, energy grids. These aren't lone actors. They're part of a coordinated playbook designed to trigger maximum instability before any flag is planted. The real first strike might not look like war. It might look like silence, a blackout that spreads faster than it can be explained. No power, no signal, no financial clearing, no public explanation, just a pause, deliberate and disorienting, before the real terms of engagement are revealed. And when that moment comes, it won't be Taiwan that's caught off guard. It'll be everyone else. And then there's the global picture, what the Pentagon calls the multi-front challenge. The U.S. is now committed to simultaneous containment of 3 nuclear-capable adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran. Never in history has a single nation attempted this. The defense budget has ballooned. Space Force is now operationally deployed. And the U.S. military is quietly shifting toward full-spectrum dominance, with doctrine focused not just on battlefield superiority, but information supremacy, AI integration, and orbital weapons readiness. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has reportedly begun transitioning personnel into National Mobilization Readiness units. That's not just border security, that's domestic staging. It signals a posture of internal fortification, a readiness not just to repel foreign threats but to respond rapidly to upheaval within U.S. borders. These units, though still under civilian agency oversight, are training alongside military counterparts, blurring the traditional lines between law enforcement and national defense. The logistics of deployment, the communications protocols, even the gear, all are being standardized for interoperability. It's a quiet but decisive pivot toward a homeland structured for strategic resilience under conditions of prolonged global instability. Germany has announced it aims to become a fully sovereign military power, including nuclear capability under European control. Poland is constructing the largest land army in Europe. Japan has doubled its defense budget and built the most advanced naval fleet in the Pacific. Australia is stockpiling long-range missiles and integrating directly with U.S. targeting systems. In short, the age of post-Cold War disarmament is over. The rearmament is global, open, and fully funded. This isn't just a regional shift, it's a wholesale transformation of the strategic landscape. Alliances are hardening, supply chains are being militarized, and nations once reliant on U.S. security guarantees are now positioning themselves as independent power centers. Defense industries are surging, with billions flowing into hypersonics, autonomous systems, and missile shields. The old world order, built on deterrence and diplomacy, is rapidly giving way to one defined by readiness, projection, and preemption. What's emerging is not a new Cold War, but something colder, faster, and far more fragmented. And yet, the public remains largely unaware. Why? Because war is being normalized not through declarations, but through fatigue. News cycles shift from Gaza to Kyiv to Taipei and back again. But the real pattern is in the preparation. Drills, exercises, shipments, doctrines, sanctions, deterrence morphing into encirclement. The language of escalation has become routine, embedded in press releases and policy briefings, camouflaged by technical jargon and diplomatic ambiguity. Each headline feels urgent but fleeting until urgency itself becomes background noise. It's not that people don't care, it's that the sheer volume of crises has dulled the senses. Strategic moves that once would have sparked public outrage now pass with barely a comment. And in that silence, a new normal is being constructed, one where conflict is no longer an event, but an operating system quietly installing itself in the architecture of everyday life. Let's be clear, none of this guarantees war tomorrow, but all of it signals that the decision makers believe war is coming. The West isn't just preparing for conflict, it's positioning to launch it under the right justification. Think tanks in Washington and Brussels openly discuss decapitation strikes against Moscow and Tehran. These aren't fringe ideas, they're policy options. And when think tanks propose them, war rooms rehearse them. Scenarios are modeled, contingencies mapped, strike packages drafted down to the minute. It's not about if, but when the trigger is deemed justified, by provocation, by pretext, or by design.